April 25, 1945. The concrete bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin trembled as Soviet artillery pounded the city above. At 3,000 meters overhead, Allied bombers continued their relentless assault on what remained of the German capital. In the dimly lit command room, the German leader sat hunched over maps that no longer reflected reality, his trembling hands tracing phantom army movements across territories already lost. He believed his final orders would somehow turn the tide, that his remaining forces would execute one last miraculous counterattack that would save the crumbling regime. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What the German leader could never have imagined in those final moments was that among the Allied forces closing in on his scattered troops, African-American soldiers would play a decisive role in accepting the surrender of his most elite units, forever shattering the racial ideologies his regime had propagated for 12 devastating years. Sergeant James Washington of the 361st Infantry Regiment pressed his face against the cold metal of his M4 Sherman tank as it rumbled through the Bavarian countryside. The morning mist of April 26th hung thick between the pine trees, reducing visibility to less than 50 meters. Behind him, the steady vibration of the tank's Ford GAA V8 engine created a rhythmic pulse that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat over the past 11 months of combat across Europe. Washington adjusted his steel helmet and squinted through the periscope. Somewhere ahead lay the remnants of the German Sixth Army, reportedly in full retreat toward what they hoped would be American rather than Soviet lines. Intelligence reports suggested that entire divisions were abandoning their positions, their officers desperately seeking Allied forces to surrender to before the Red Army could reach them. The irony was not lost on Washington. Here he was, a 24-year-old from Detroit, whose grandfather had been born into slavery, now advancing through the heartland of a regime that had declared his race inferior. His unit, part of the segregated American military, had fought with distinction through Italy, southern France, and now into Germany itself. Yet even as they liberated concentration camps and defeated German forces, they knew they would return to a homeland where many restaurants would refuse them service and many hotels would turn them away. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hayes, commanding officer of the 761st Tank Battalion, monitored radio communications from his command vehicle 300 meters behind Washington's position. Static crackled through his headset as field reports filtered in from across the advancing American front. The 12th Army Group under General Omar Bradley was making unprecedented gains, with some units advancing 30 kilometers per day against increasingly disorganized German resistance. Hayes had served with distinction since the North African campaign, leading his all-black tank battalion through some of the war's most challenging terrain. His men had proven themselves repeatedly, earning commendations that would have made headlines if the military had not maintained strict segregation policies. Now, as they advanced deeper into Bavaria, Hayes sensed they were approaching something historically significant. Through his field glasses, Hayes observed smoke columns rising from the valley below. German vehicles moved in apparent disorder along the main road, some bearing white flags or makeshift surrender banners. Radio intercepts suggested that major German units were actively seeking American forces to surrender to, having heard reports that the Soviets were executing officers and sending enlisted men to Siberian labor camps. Captain Müller of the German 6th Army's 42nd Infantry Division crouched behind a damaged Panzer IV tank, his uniform torn and stained with mud from 3 weeks of continuous retreat. Around him, his remaining soldiers displayed the hollow expressions of men who had witnessed their entire worldview collapse. The 1,000-year Reich that had promised to last a millennium was ending after just 12 years, and Müller found himself desperately seeking American forces to surrender to. Müller had grown up believing in the racial superiority doctrines that the German regime had promoted throughout his education. He had been taught that African peoples were subhuman, that the American military was weakened by racial integration, and that German genetic superiority would ultimately triumph over the mongrel American forces. Now, as his ammunition ran low and his men faced starvation, those teachings seemed increasingly hollow. The sound of approaching tank engines grew louder. Through the morning mist, Muller glimpsed the distinctive silhouette of American Sherman tanks, advancing in tactical formation. His radio man, Private Hoffman, tapped his shoulder and pointed toward movement in the tree line. American infantry were flanking their position with professional precision, their movements coordinated and purposeful. Muller raised his white flag higher and stepped into the open road. Behind him, 47 soldiers of what had once been a full-strength company emerged from their hiding places, their hands raised in surrender. The irony struck Muller immediately as the first American tank came into full view, and he saw the face of Sergeant Washington through the commander's hatch. The man accepting his surrender was precisely the type of person his regime had taught him to consider racially inferior. Washington brought his tank to a halt 30 meters from the surrendering Germans and climbed down from the turret. His Thompson submachine gun remained slung across his shoulder as he approached Captain Müller, whose iron cross still gleamed on his dirty uniform. The German officer's eyes widened as he realized that this African-American sergeant would be processing his surrender. Müller had expected to feel hatred or fear when confronted by American forces. Instead, he found himself experiencing something far more unsettling: confusion. The man before him carried himself with quiet dignity and professional competence that contradicted everything Müller had been taught about racial hierarchies. Washington's uniform was properly maintained, despite weeks in the field. His equipment was in excellent condition, and his demeanor was that of a seasoned combat veteran. Washington spoke in basic German, learned during his advance through the country. "You are surrendering your unit?" Müller nodded, his voice catching slightly as he replied in English. "Yes, Sergeant. My men and I surrender to American forces." The formality of the moment struck both men. Here was a German officer, trained in doctrines of racial supremacy, formally surrendering to an African-American non-commissioned officer whose very presence challenged the ideological foundations of the regime Müller had served. Lieutenant Robert Chen of the Intelligence Section arrived on the scene within minutes, accompanied by Sergeant First Class Thomas Anderson, another African-American soldier who served as the battalion's interrogation specialist. Anderson had attended Howard University before the conflict and spoke fluent German, making him invaluable for prisoner processing. Anderson began the formal surrender procedures, documenting each German soldier's name, rank, and unit designation. As he worked, Captain Müller found himself studying the American soldiers more closely. Their equipment was superior to anything his unit had seen for months. Their rations were plentiful enough that they offered food to the hungry German prisoners. Most unsettling of all, they treated their prisoners with professional courtesy rather than the brutality that German propaganda had predicted. The German propaganda Müller had absorbed throughout his military service had painted a picture of American forces as racially divided and militarily inferior. He had been taught that African-American soldiers were cowards who would flee at the first sign of serious combat, that they lacked the intelligence for complex military operations, and that they were kept in support roles because they could not be trusted in frontline positions. Reality proved dramatically different. Washington's tank crew operated their vehicle with practiced efficiency. Their radio communications were crisp and professional. When Anderson conducted his interrogation, his questions demonstrated detailed knowledge of German military organization and tactical doctrine. These men were clearly veterans of extensive combat experience. Staff Sergeant David Robinson, the tank battalion's maintenance chief, supervised the collection of German weapons and equipment. Robinson had grown up in rural Alabama, where he had experienced the full weight of Jim Crow segregation. Signs reading "whites only" had defined the boundaries of his childhood world. He had been refused service at restaurants, excluded from public facilities, and reminded daily of his supposed inferior status. Now, as he efficiently organized the surrendered German equipment, Robinson reflected on the bitter irony of his situation. In Germany, he was helping to defeat a regime built on racial superiority, while knowing he would return to an America where his own racial equality remained contested. The German prisoners looked at him with mixtures of surprise and confusion, their indoctrinated beliefs challenged by the reality of his professional competence. Captain Mueller watched Robinson's work with growing unease. The maintenance procedures Robinson followed were more systematic than anything Mueller had seen in his own units during the final months of the conflict. Robinson's tools were better maintained, his approach more methodical, and his supervision of both American and German soldiers was quietly authoritative. The surrender processing continued throughout the afternoon. Additional German units approached the American position, drawn by word that the Americans were accepting surrenders and treating prisoners according to international conventions. By evening, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes found himself responsible for over 300 German prisoners, ranging from teenage conscripts to veteran officers. Among the surrendering Germans was Major Klaus Weber, a career officer who had served on the Eastern Front before his transfer to the Western Theater. Weber had commanded a tank destroyer unit and possessed extensive combat experience against Soviet forces. Like Captain Mueller, Weber found himself confronting the collapse of everything he had believed about racial hierarchies and military capability. Weber approached Sergeant First Class Anderson during the evening prisoner meal. The American soldier was distributing canned rations to the German prisoners, ensuring each man received adequate food despite supply constraints. Weber had not eaten a proper meal in 4 days, and the American field rations represented luxury compared to the turnips and ersatz bread his unit had been surviving on. Weber spoke to Anderson in careful English. "Sergeant, I must ask you something. In our training, we were taught that your people could not be trusted in combat, that you would run when fighting became serious, but your unit moves like veterans." Anderson looked up from his distribution duties, studying Weber's face for signs of mockery or challenge. Finding none, he replied simply, "We've been fighting since Italy. Sicily, Naples, Anzio, then southern France, now here. You learn fast when your life depends on it." The simplicity of Anderson's response struck Weber profoundly. Here was no boasting, no racial rhetoric, simply the quiet statement of a professional soldier describing his experience. Weber realized that his unit had been retreating from forces that included soldiers his propaganda had dismissed as militarily irrelevant. That night, as German prisoners settled into the temporary compound Hayes's men had established, conversations began that would challenge deeply held beliefs on both sides. Private Hoffman, Captain Mueller's radio man, found himself talking with Corporal Willie Johnson, an African-American soldier from Mississippi who had joined the army to escape the sharecropping system that had trapped his family in poverty. Johnson shared his rations with Hoffman, despite having received explicit orders that fraternization with prisoners was discouraged. The two young men, similar in age and both far from home, discovered common ground in their experiences of military service, even as they had recently been trying to eliminate each other. Hoffman had grown up in a small Bavarian town where he had never encountered anyone of African descent. His knowledge of racial matters had come entirely from German propaganda films and educational materials that portrayed Black Americans as primitive and threatening. Sitting beside Johnson and sharing American cigarettes, Hoffman found those images impossible to reconcile with the reality of the competent, thoughtful soldier beside him. Johnson, for his part, had expected to find fanatical adherence to racial ideology among the German prisoners. Instead, he discovered young men not unlike himself, caught up in events beyond their control and desperate to survive long enough to return home. The humanity he recognized in Hoffman challenged his own assumptions about the enemy they had been fighting. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes monitored these interactions with growing interest. As a career military officer, Hayes understood the psychological impact of surrender on defeated forces. What he had not anticipated was the profound ideological confusion his prisoners were experiencing as their racial beliefs confronted contradictory evidence. Hayes had read captured German training materials that described American forces as racially divided and militarily weak due to the presence of African-American soldiers. German intelligence assessments had suggested that racial tensions would undermine American unit cohesion and that black soldiers would prove unreliable under pressure. The reality of his battalion's performance provided dramatic counter-evidence to these assessments. His tank crews had maintained higher operational readiness rates than many white units. His maintenance sections kept vehicles running under the most challenging conditions. His communication specialists handled complex radio procedures with greater accuracy than the Army average. By any objective measure, his unit was performing at the highest levels of military professionalism. The next morning brought additional surrendering German units, including elements of the prestigious 1st Panzer Division. Among these prisoners was Colonel Ernst Richter, a decorated veteran who had commanded armored formations since the early days of the conflict. Richter had participated in the rapid advances through Poland, France, and the initial stages of the invasion of the Soviet Union. Richter's worldview had been shaped by early German successes that seemed to confirm theories about Aryan military superiority. The rapid defeats of Polish, French, and initial Soviet resistance had reinforced his belief that German racial and cultural advantages would ultimately guarantee victory. Now, as he formally surrendered his remaining forces to Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, those certainties crumbled. Hayes conducted Richter's surrender interview personally, recognizing the intelligence value of capturing such a senior officer. As the two men sat across from each other in Hayes's command tent, the historical significance of the moment was apparent to both. A German colonel, trained in doctrines of racial supremacy, was providing detailed intelligence to an African-American lieutenant colonel, whose very presence in command position contradicted everything the German military had been taught about American racial hierarchies. Richter found himself impressed, despite his ideological conditioning. Hayes's questions demonstrated sophisticated understanding of German tactical doctrine and strategic planning. His maps were annotated with accurate intelligence about German unit dispositions and supply situations. His command presence was unmistakably that of an experienced combat leader. During their conversation, Richter made an observation that would haunt him for years afterward. "Colonel Hayes, I must tell you that our intelligence about American forces was clearly inadequate. We were told that racial integration would weaken your military effectiveness. What I observe here suggests the opposite may be true." Hayes considered his response carefully. He understood that this conversation represented more than military intelligence gathering. It was a moment when fundamental assumptions about human capability and worth were being tested against observable reality. Hayes replied, "Colonel Richter, my soldiers perform their duties according to military standards, regardless of their background. We have found that competence and courage are not determined by race, but by training, leadership, and unit cohesion." The simplicity of Hayes's statement belied its revolutionary implications. In a world where racial hierarchy had been accepted as scientific fact by millions of people, the evidence provided by Hayes's battalion suggested that such hierarchies were social constructions rather than natural law. Additional German officers began requesting personal meetings with Hayes and his senior staff. Word had spread among the prisoners that the American unit they had surrendered to was commanded by African-American officers, and that these officers demonstrated professional competence that challenged German preconceptions about racial capability. Major Weber, who had initially questioned Anderson about combat experience, requested permission to observe American maintenance procedures. As a former tank commander, Weber understood the critical importance of mechanical reliability in armored operations. What he observed in Robinson's maintenance sections contradicted his assumptions about African-American technical capabilities. Robinson's crews performed complex engine maintenance with precision and efficiency. Their tool accountability exceeded German standards. Their troubleshooting procedures were more systematic than anything Weber had seen in his own units. Most significantly, Robinson's leadership style generated willing cooperation from his subordinates rather than the fear-based compliance that had characterized Weber's own command experience. Weber later wrote in his diary, "I have been forced to reconsider everything I believed about racial differences in technical ability. The American maintenance procedures I observed today were superior to our own methods in every measurable way. If racial theory cannot explain this disparity, then perhaps racial theory itself requires examination." The psychological impact of these observations extended beyond individual prisoners to affect their understanding of the conflict itself. If German assumptions about American racial weaknesses had been incorrect, what other aspects of their worldview might prove equally flawed? Sergeant Washington continued his duties processing additional surrendering units. now numbering over 500 German soldiers. Each interaction reinforced the same pattern: German expectations based on racial propaganda confronting the reality of professional American military performance. Washington had grown up in Detroit's industrial neighborhoods, where his father had worked in automobile manufacturing before the conflict began. The family had experienced both the opportunities and limitations of northern urban life for African Americans. Washington understood that his military service occurred within a broader context of American racial inequality, yet he also recognized the unique position his combat experience had created. Here, in the Bavarian countryside, Washington found himself in a position of authority over men who had been taught to consider him racially inferior. The irony was not lost on him that he was helping to defeat a regime built on racial supremacy while representing a nation that maintained its own racial segregation policies. Washington's interactions with German prisoners revealed the profound confusion many experienced as their ideological foundations crumbled. Captain Muller continued to observe Washington's leadership style, noting how the American sergeant maintained discipline through example rather than intimidation, how he ensured fair treatment for all personnel under his supervision, and how he demonstrated technical competence that contradicted German assumptions about African American military capabilities. By the third day of surrender operations, Hayes's unit had processed over 800 German prisoners, representing elements from 6 different divisions. The administrative complexity of managing such numbers required sophisticated organization and record-keeping that impressed even senior German officers. Colonel Richter found himself assigned to assist with prisoner administration, working directly under Sergeant First Class Anderson's supervision. The role reversal was striking. A German colonel taking direction from an African-American non-commissioned officer whose educational background and professional competence challenged every assumption Richter had held about racial hierarchies. Anderson's organizational methods proved superior to anything Richter had implemented in his own units. The American filing systems were more comprehensive, their personnel tracking more accurate, and their supply distribution more equitable than standard German procedures. Richter gradually realized that he was learning improved administrative techniques from a man his training had taught him to consider intellectually inferior. The psychological transformation occurring among the German prisoners began affecting their behavior in measurable ways. Discipline problems, common in prisoner-of-war situations, remained minimal despite the large numbers involved. German officers found themselves cooperating willingly with American directives, partly from military necessity, but increasingly from growing respect for their captors' professional competence. Private Hoffman, who had initially been shocked to find himself captured by African-American soldiers, now served as an unofficial liaison between German prisoners and American guards. His changing attitudes reflected a broader transformation occurring throughout the prisoner population. Hoffman later described his experience in a letter home. "Everything we were taught about the American military has proven incorrect. The soldiers who captured us demonstrate discipline and competence that equals or exceeds our own forces. Their equipment is superior, their organization more efficient, and their treatment of prisoners more humane than we were led to expect. I'm beginning to question other things we were taught as well." The intelligence value of these prisoners proved extraordinary. Senior German officers, impressed by their treatment and confused by the collapse of their ideological certainties, provided detailed information about German defensive positions, supply situations, and command structures. This intelligence proved crucial for American forces advancing deeper into Bavaria. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes found himself in regular communication with higher headquarters about the unprecedented intelligence windfall his unit had generated. Division intelligence officers arrived to conduct detailed debriefings with senior German prisoners, many of whom had served in key staff positions and possessed strategic-level information. What struck the visiting intelligence officers was the willingness of German prisoners to cooperate with their African-American captors. Standard intelligence doctrine suggested that ideologically motivated prisoners would resist interrogation, particularly when conducted by soldiers they had been trained to consider racially inferior. Instead, the opposite occurred. German officers seemed eager to discuss military matters with American personnel whose competence had challenged their fundamental assumptions. Major Weber's conversations with these intelligence officers revealed the depth of German misconceptions about American military capability. Weber explained that German planning had assumed African American soldiers would be relegated to support roles, and that their presence in combat units would create disciplinary problems and reduce military effectiveness. The reality Weber observed suggested that African American soldiers were among the most motivated and disciplined troops in the American military. Their performance levels consistently exceeded German expectations, their unit cohesion was stronger than comparable German formations, and their leadership demonstrated tactical sophistication that challenged German assumptions about racial aptitude for military command. These observations began affecting German strategic assessments of the conflict itself. If German intelligence had been systematically wrong about American racial dynamics and military capability, what other fundamental assumptions about the conflict might prove equally flawed? Colonel Richter's daily reports to American intelligence officers included increasingly detailed assessments of German military weaknesses that went beyond tactical considerations. Richter began analyzing how racial ideology had distorted German intelligence gathering, leading to strategic miscalculations that contributed to military defeat. Richter explained that German commanders had consistently underestimated American industrial capacity, partly because they assumed racial tensions would disrupt war production. They had expected African American workers to be less productive and more prone to labor disputes than white workers. Intelligence reports from America had focused on racial conflicts, while ignoring evidence of successful racial cooperation in war industries. Similarly, German naval intelligence had assumed that racial integration in the American merchant marine would create disciplinary problems that would reduce shipping efficiency. Instead, American convoy operations had proven remarkably successful, with integrated crews demonstrating higher morale and better performance than German intelligence had predicted. These systematic intelligence failures, Richter realized, stemmed from ideological assumptions that prevented accurate assessment of enemy capabilities. The German military had seen what it expected to see rather than what actually existed, leading to strategic planning based on wishful thinking rather than objective analysis. The personal transformations occurring among individual German prisoners reflected broader questions about the ideological foundations of the conflict itself. As these men confronted evidence that contradicted their racial beliefs, they began questioning other aspects of the worldview that had justified years of warfare and suffering. Sergeant Washington observed these changes with growing interest. His conversations with German prisoners revealed men struggling to reconcile their lived experience with their ideological training. Many expressed confusion about why they had been taught to fear and hate people who were demonstrating kindness and competence. Washington understood that he was witnessing the collapse of a belief system that had justified enormous human suffering. The men who surrendered to his unit were discovering that their enemies were neither the monsters nor the inferior beings they had been told to expect. Instead, they encountered fellow human beings whose competence and dignity challenged the racial categories that had defined their worldview. The broader military situation continued evolving rapidly as German resistance collapsed across multiple fronts. Radio communications brought news of additional surrenders throughout Bavaria, with entire army groups seeking Allied forces to surrender rather than face Soviet capture. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes received orders to transfer his prisoners to rear area facilities and continue advancing toward Austria. The temporary prisoner compound his unit had established would be turned over to military police units specialized in large-scale prisoner management. As Hayes prepared for this transfer, he reflected on the historical significance of what his unit had accomplished. Beyond the military value of the prisoners and intelligence they had captured, his African-American soldiers had delivered a devastating blow to racial ideology simply by performing their duties with professional competence. The German officers who had surrendered to Hayes's unit would carry the memory of their experience for the rest of their lives. They had been forced to confront the hollowness of racial supremacy theories through direct observation of evidence that contradicted those theories. Their certainties about human hierarchy had crumbled not through philosophical argument, but through personal encounter with realities that could not be dismissed or explained away. Hayes understood that this impact extended beyond the immediate military situation. These German prisoners would return to their communities, carrying memories of competent, dignified African-American soldiers who had treated them with professional courtesy, despite years of indoctrination that had portrayed such courtesy as impossible. The final prisoner transfer occurred on May 2, 1945. As German officers prepared to move to permanent prisoner of war facilities, many requested opportunities to express their gratitude to their American captors. These expressions went beyond routine military courtesy to include personal acknowledgments of how their experience had challenged their fundamental beliefs. Captain Mueller approached Sergeant Washington before the transfer, speaking carefully in English. "Sergeant Washington, I want you to know that meeting you and your soldiers has changed how I understand many things. I was taught that your people were our enemies, not just in this conflict, but as a matter of natural law. I now believe those teachings were wrong about natural law, and perhaps wrong about other matters as well." Washington accepted Mueller's statement with the same quiet dignity he had maintained throughout their interactions. He understood that Mueller was attempting to articulate a transformation that went beyond military surrender, to include the collapse of a worldview that had justified years of hatred and violence. Similar conversations occurred throughout the prisoner transfer process. German soldiers who had never previously encountered African Americans found themselves grappling with evidence that contradicted everything they had been taught about racial differences in intelligence, courage, and moral character. Sergeant First Class Anderson supervised the final administrative procedures with typical efficiency. His records of prisoner processing would later be cited as exemplary by division headquarters, contributing to recommendations for unit commendations that recognized the exceptional performance of Hayes's battalion. Anderson had grown up in Washington, D.C., where he had experienced both the opportunities and limitations of life in the nation's segregated capital. He had attended Howard University on a scholarship before military service, majoring in history and developing interests in international relations that made his military intelligence work particularly satisfying. Now, as he completed the prisoner transfer documentation, Anderson reflected on the broader historical implications of what they had accomplished. These German prisoners had experienced firsthand the collapse of racial ideology that had justified their nation's aggressive expansion and brutal occupation policies. The intelligence value of their surrender would contribute to Allied victory in Europe. But perhaps more importantly, their transformed understanding of racial matters would influence post-conflict reconstruction of German society. These men would return to their communities carrying evidence that racial supremacy theories were not just morally wrong, but factually incorrect. Staff Sergeant Robinson completed his final maintenance inspections as the unit prepared to resume its advance toward Austria. His crews had maintained exceptional operational readiness rates throughout the prisoner processing operations, keeping all vehicles in perfect working condition despite the additional demands of managing large numbers of surrendering Germans. Robinson had grown up in rural Alabama, where racial segregation had been enforced through both law and custom. He had been excluded from public facilities, denied educational opportunities, and constantly reminded of his supposed inferior status within American society. The irony of his current position was not lost on Robinson. Here in Germany, he was helping to defeat a regime built on racial supremacy while representing a nation that maintained its own racial segregation policies. Yet his professional competence had earned respect from German prisoners who had been taught to consider him racially inferior. Robinson understood that his military service was occurring during a unique moment in history when American racial contradictions were exposed to international scrutiny. African American soldiers were simultaneously fighting against racial supremacy abroad while experiencing racial discrimination at home. The psychological impact on German prisoners of encountering competent, dignified African American soldiers extended beyond individual transformation to affect their understanding of the conflict itself. Many began questioning not just racial ideology, but other aspects of the worldview that had justified years of aggressive warfare. Major Weber had spent considerable time discussing these matters with other German officers in the prisoner compound. Their conversations revealed growing recognition that German strategic planning had been distorted by ideological assumptions that prevented accurate assessment of enemy capabilities. Weber later wrote in his journal, "If we were wrong about American racial dynamics, what else were we wrong about? Our intelligence consistently underestimated American industrial production, military organization, and strategic planning. Perhaps these underestimations reflected ideological bias rather than objective analysis." This recognition that ideology had distorted German strategic thinking began affecting prisoner cooperation with Allied intelligence efforts. German officers became increasingly willing to provide detailed information about military operations, partly from recognition that their previous strategic assessments had been fundamentally flawed. The final departure of Hayes's unit from the prisoner processing area occurred on May 3rd, as reports arrived of Germany's impending total surrender. The European conflict would end within days, bringing to a close 6 years of warfare that had devastated the continent and challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and social organization. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes conducted his final radio communication with division headquarters from his command vehicle as the battalion resumed its advance. His report summarized prisoner numbers, intelligence gathered, and administrative procedures completed. But Hayes understood that the statistical summary could not capture the historical significance of what had occurred. His African-American soldiers had delivered a decisive blow to racial ideology, not through propaganda or political argument, but through professional competence and human dignity demonstrated under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. The German officers who had surrendered to his unit would carry the memory of this experience for the rest of their lives. Hayes had entered military service knowing that he would face discrimination and limited opportunities despite his qualifications and performance. He had commanded his battalion through some of the most challenging combat operations of the conflict, while knowing that his achievements would receive less recognition than those of comparable white officers. Yet here, in the Bavarian countryside, Hayes had achieved something beyond military victory. He had demonstrated that racial supremacy theories were not just morally reprehensible, but factually incorrect. His unit's performance had provided irrefutable evidence that competence and character were determined by factors other than racial background. As the column of American tanks and vehicles resumed its advance eastward, German civilians began emerging from hiding places to observe the conquering forces. Many had been told to expect brutal occupation by racially inferior American troops who would prove incapable of maintaining order or providing security. Instead, they observed disciplined military formations that moved with professional precision and maintained exemplary standards of equipment and appearance. The African-American soldiers they had been taught to fear demonstrated the same competence and dignity that had impressed German prisoners throughout the surrender process. Sergeant Washington maintained his position in the tank commander's hatch as the battalion advanced through increasingly mountainous terrain toward the Austrian border. Behind them, the prisoner processing area was being converted to a permanent facility for managing the thousands of German soldiers continuing to surrender throughout Bavaria. Washington understood that he was participating in the final phase of a conflict that had challenged fundamental assumptions about human worth and capability. The racial ideology that had justified years of aggressive expansion and brutal occupation policies had been confronted by evidence too compelling to dismiss or ignore. The German officers who had surrendered to Washington's unit had been forced to acknowledge that their beliefs about racial hierarchy were contradicted by observable reality. This acknowledgement would influence their post-conflict attitudes and behaviors in ways that extended far beyond military considerations. Washington had grown up in Detroit's African-American community, where families maintained strong traditions despite facing systematic discrimination and limited opportunities. His military service had provided him with experiences and responsibilities that would have been impossible in civilian life due to racial barriers. Now, as the conflict neared its end, Washington understood that he and his fellow African-American soldiers had achieved something unprecedented in American history. They had proven their worth as combat soldiers, while simultaneously demonstrating that racial supremacy theories were factually incorrect. The broader historical implications of these achievements would unfold over subsequent decades as American society grappled with the contradictions exposed by African-American military service. Soldiers who had fought against racial supremacy abroad would return home to challenge racial discrimination in their own country. The final radio communications from division headquarters confirmed that German resistance had collapsed across all sectors and that total surrender was expected within hours. The European phase of the global conflict was ending, bringing to a close the most destructive war in human history. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes gathered his senior staff for a final briefing as they established their positions along the Austrian border. The military situation had evolved so rapidly that their original objectives had become irrelevant, replaced by occupation duties that would extend far beyond the formal end of hostilities. Hayes understood that his unit's role in accepting German surrenders represented only one small episode in the vast scope of the conflict. Yet he also recognized that their actions had contributed to a transformation in human understanding that would influence history for generations to come. The African-American soldiers of his battalion had confronted racial ideology with evidence too powerful to dismiss. They had demonstrated that competence and character were determined by factors other than racial background. They had proven that diversity could strengthen rather than weaken military effectiveness. These lessons would resonate far beyond the immediate military context. The German officers who had surrendered to Hayes's unit would return to their communities, carrying memories of competent, dignified African-American soldiers who had challenged their fundamental assumptions about human worth and capability. The psychological impact of these encounters would contribute to post-conflict reconstruction of German society and influence broader international understanding of racial matters. The evidence provided by Hayes's battalion would become part of a growing body of proof that racial supremacy theories were not just morally wrong, but factually incorrect. As evening approached on May 5, 1945, reports confirmed that Germany had formally surrendered to Allied forces. The European conflict was officially over, ending 6 years of warfare that had cost tens of millions of lives and devastated much of the continent. Hayes's battalion established their final positions in a valley overlooking the Salzach River, where they would begin transition to occupation duties that would last for years rather than months. The immediate military objectives had been achieved, but the broader task of reconstructing European society would require sustained effort and resources. The German prisoners they had processed during the surrender operations were now scattered across multiple prisoner-of-war facilities throughout the American occupation zone. Many would spend years in captivity before returning to their homes and communities. The memories they carried of their surrender experience would influence their post-conflict attitudes and behaviors. Captain Müller, who had been among the first German officers to surrender to Washington's unit, found himself in a permanent prisoner facility near Frankfurt. His daily conversations with other prisoners often returned to their shared experience of surrendering to African-American soldiers whose competence had challenged their racial beliefs. Müller wrote in his diary, "I have had time to reflect on what we observed during our surrender. The American soldiers who captured us demonstrated every quality we were taught to respect in military personnel. Their equipment was superior, their organization more efficient, and their treatment of prisoners more humane than our own forces provided. If our racial theories could not explain these observations, perhaps our racial theories were incorrect." Similar reflections appeared in correspondence and diaries throughout the German prisoner population. Men who had never previously questioned racial ideology found themselves grappling with evidence that contradicted their fundamental beliefs about human hierarchy and social organization. Major Weber, now imprisoned near Munich, began conducting informal educational sessions with other prisoners about what they had observed during their surrender experience. These discussions often focused on how German intelligence had systematically underestimated American military capabilities due to ideological assumptions about racial integration. Weber explained to fellow prisoners that German strategic planning had assumed racial diversity would weaken American forces rather than strengthen them. This assumption had contributed to intelligence failures that affected military operations throughout the conflict. The recognition that ideology had distorted German strategic thinking began influencing prisoner attitudes toward other aspects of their former worldview. Many began questioning not just racial theories, but other elements of the belief system that had justified years of aggressive warfare and occupation policies. Meanwhile, Hayes's battalion continued their advance into Austria, where they encountered additional German units seeking to surrender to American rather than Soviet forces. The patterns observed during their Bavarian operations repeated themselves. German officers expressing surprise at African-American military competence and gradually acknowledging that their racial assumptions had been incorrect. These encounters provided additional evidence of the systematic nature of German misconceptions about American racial dynamics. Throughout the German military hierarchy, officers had been trained to expect that racial integration would create disciplinary problems and reduce combat effectiveness. Instead, German officers consistently observed that African-American units demonstrated exceptional discipline, superior equipment maintenance, and innovative tactical approaches that exceeded German expectations. These observations forced many to question fundamental assumptions about racial differences in military capability. Sergeant First Class Anderson continued his intelligence-gathering duties as the battalion processed additional surrendering German units along the Austrian border. His interrogation techniques had proven exceptionally effective, partly because German officers were eager to discuss their observations about American military organization with someone whose competence challenged their preconceptions. Anderson's educational background enabled him to place these conversations within broader historical and social contexts that revealed the systematic nature of German ideological misconceptions. His reports to Division Intelligence became increasingly detailed analyses of how racial ideology had distorted German strategic thinking throughout the conflict. These analyses would later contribute to post-conflict studies of German military decision-making that revealed how ideological assumptions had prevented accurate assessment of enemy capabilities. The intelligence value of these insights extended far beyond immediate military applications to influence broader understanding of how prejudice affects institutional performance. Staff Sergeant Robinson supervised maintenance operations for the battalion's vehicles as they established permanent positions along the Austrian frontier. His crews had maintained exceptional operational readiness rates throughout the surrender operations, demonstrating technical competence that consistently impressed German observers. Robinson's leadership style had evolved throughout his military service to emphasize professional development and technical excellence among his subordinates. His maintenance sections had become models of efficiency that were studied by other units seeking to improve their own performance standards. The German mechanics, who had been assigned to assist with equipment maintenance under Robinson's supervision, found themselves learning advanced techniques and procedures that exceeded their previous training. Many expressed surprise at the sophistication of American maintenance methods and the technical knowledge demonstrated by African-American personnel. These interactions provided additional evidence of the gap between German assumptions about racial capability and the reality of African-American professional competence. German personnel consistently discovered that their expectations based on racial ideology were contradicted by observable evidence. As spring turned to summer in 1945, the immediate post-conflict period began revealing the long-term implications of what Hayes's battalion had accomplished during the surrender operations. The German officers who had been processed through their facility were now scattered throughout the Allied prison system, but their transformed understanding of racial matters would influence their post-conflict attitudes and behaviors. Intelligence reports from various prisoner-of-war facilities indicated that German prisoners who had surrendered to African-American units demonstrated significantly different attitudes toward racial matters compared to those who had been captured by white American forces. The personal experience of surrendering to competent, dignified African-American soldiers had provided evidence that contradicted years of ideological indoctrination. This transformation extended beyond individual attitude change to affect broader German understanding of the conflict itself. Many former German officers began analyzing how racial ideology had contributed to strategic miscalculations that had led to military defeat. Colonel Richter, now imprisoned near Nuremberg, spent considerable time writing detailed analyses of German military decision-making throughout the conflict. His manuscripts, later preserved in military archives, documented how ideological assumptions had prevented accurate assessment of American capabilities and contributed to strategic planning errors. Richter's analysis revealed that German intelligence had consistently underestimated American industrial production, partly because racial ideology suggested that diverse workforces would be less productive than homogeneous ones. Similarly, German naval planning had assumed that racial integration in the American merchant marine would create disciplinary problems that would reduce shipping efficiency. These assumptions had proven systematically incorrect, leading to strategic planning based on wishful thinking rather than objective analysis. The recognition of these intelligence failures forced many German officers to question other aspects of their ideological worldview. The psychological impact of these revelations extended throughout German society as prisoners began returning to their communities, carrying memories of their surrender experiences. Many found themselves unable to maintain previous racial beliefs in the face of evidence they had personally observed. The broader implications of these attitude changes would influence German post-conflict reconstruction in ways that extended far beyond immediate political considerations. The evidence provided by African American military competence had delivered a devastating blow to racial ideology that would contribute to fundamental changes in German social attitudes. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes received orders in late June to transfer his battalion to occupation duties in central Germany, where they would be responsible for maintaining order and assisting with reconstruction efforts in war-damaged communities. These duties would extend their European service for an additional year beyond the formal end of hostilities. Hayes understood that their occupation responsibilities would provide additional opportunities to demonstrate African American competence and professionalism to German civilian populations who had been exposed to years of racial propaganda. His soldiers would serve as living contradictions to theories of racial hierarchy simply by performing their duties with characteristic excellence. The historical significance of Hayes's battalion's contributions to Allied victory extended far beyond their immediate military achievements. They had participated in the defeat of racial supremacy ideology, not just through combat effectiveness, but through personal example that challenged fundamental assumptions about human worth and capability. As Hayes prepared for the battalion's transition to occupation duties, he reflected on the transformation he had witnessed among German prisoners who had surrendered to his unit. Men who had been trained to consider African Americans racially inferior had been forced to acknowledge that their beliefs were contradicted by observable evidence. This acknowledgement represented more than simple attitude change. It constituted recognition that racial supremacy theories were factually incorrect rather than merely politically objectionable. The evidence provided by Hayes's soldiers had been too compelling to dismiss through rationalization or denial. Hayes understood that his unit's achievements occurred within the broader context of African American military service that would influence post-conflict American society in fundamental ways. Soldiers who had proven their worth in combat would return home to challenge racial discrimination with evidence of their capabilities. The contradictions between fighting against racial supremacy abroad while experiencing racial discrimination at home would become increasingly difficult to maintain as American society grappled with the implications of African American military service during the conflict. Sergeant Washington completed his final administrative duties as the battalion prepared for their transfer to occupation responsibilities. His experience processing German surrenders had provided him with unique insights into the psychology of ideological transformation and the power of personal example to challenge deeply held beliefs. Washington had observed German officers struggling to reconcile their racial assumptions with evidence that contradicted those assumptions. Their confusion and gradual acknowledgement that their beliefs had been incorrect demonstrated how personal encounter could achieve what argument and propaganda could not. Washington understood that he had participated in something historically unprecedented, the systematic demonstration that racial supremacy theories were not just morally wrong, but factually incorrect. His military service had provided evidence that would influence understanding of racial matters for generations to come. As the battalion's vehicles formed up for their move to new positions, Washington reflected on the irony of his situation. He had helped defeat a regime built on racial supremacy, while representing a nation that maintained its own racial segregation policies. Yet his professional competence had earned recognition and respect that would have been impossible in civilian life. Washington knew that he would return to an America where his military achievements would receive limited recognition and where racial barriers would continue to limit his opportunities. Yet he also understood that his service had contributed to changes that would ultimately transform American society. The evidence provided by African American military service would become impossible to ignore or dismiss. The men who had surrendered to Washington's unit would carry memories of competent, dignified African American soldiers for the rest of their lives, contributing to international recognition that racial supremacy theories were scientifically invalid. The final movement to occupation positions occurred in early July, as Hayes's battalion established new headquarters in a small Bavarian town that would become their home for the next 14 months. Their responsibilities would include maintaining civil order, supervising reconstruction efforts, and processing the continuing flow of German personnel returning from various theaters of the conflict. These duties would provide additional opportunities to demonstrate African American competence to German civilian populations and returning soldiers who had been exposed to racial propaganda throughout the conflict. Each interaction would contribute to the growing body of evidence that racial theories were contradicted by observable reality. The long-term implications of what Hayes's battalion had accomplished during the surrender operations would extend far beyond immediate military considerations. They had participated in the destruction of racial ideology through personal example that could not be dismissed or explained away. The German officers who had surrendered to their unit would spend years in prisoner-of-war facilities, reflecting on their experience and gradually acknowledging that their fundamental assumptions about racial hierarchy had been incorrect. This acknowledgement would influence their post-conflict attitudes and behaviors in ways that would contribute to broader social transformation. As summer progressed into autumn of 1945, reports from prisoner-of-war facilities throughout the Allied occupation zones confirmed that German prisoners who had surrendered to African American units demonstrated significantly different attitudes toward racial matters compared to other prisoner populations. These attitude changes reflected more than simple expedient adaptation to changed circumstances. They represented genuine recognition that racial supremacy theories were factually incorrect. The evidence provided by African American military competence had been too compelling to dismiss through rationalization or denial. Intelligence analyses of these attitude changes began revealing the broader implications of African American military service for post-conflict reconstruction of European society. The systematic demonstration that racial theories were scientifically invalid would influence international understanding of human equality and social organization. The historical significance of these achievements would become apparent only gradually, as post-conflict society grappled with the implications of evidence that had destroyed fundamental assumptions about racial hierarchy and human worth. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes continued his occupation duties throughout the winter of 1945 and into the following year, supervising reconstruction efforts and maintaining civil order in his assigned sector. His battalion's performance during this period continued to demonstrate African American competence and professionalism to German civilian populations. These interactions provided additional evidence that racial supremacy theories were contradicted by observable reality. German civilians who had been exposed to years of racial propaganda found themselves confronting competent, dignified African American soldiers whose behavior challenged their fundamental assumptions about racial differences. The psychological impact of these encounters extended throughout German society as communities gradually acknowledged that their previous beliefs about racial hierarchy had been incorrect. This acknowledgement would contribute to fundamental changes in German social attitudes that would influence European society for generations. Hayes understood that his battalion's service had contributed to something historically unprecedented: the systematic demonstration that racial supremacy ideology was not just morally objectionable, but factually incorrect. The evidence they had provided would influence understanding of human equality for decades to come. As Hayes prepared for his battalion's eventual return to the United States, he reflected on the transformation they had achieved through professional competence and personal dignity. They had participated in the defeat of racial ideology not through argument or propaganda, but through evidence too compelling to dismiss. The German officers who had surrendered to Hayes's unit would carry the memory of their experience for the rest of their lives. Their acknowledgement that racial supremacy theories were incorrect would influence their post-conflict attitudes and contribute to broader social transformation throughout European society. Hayes knew that he and his soldiers would return to an America where racial discrimination continued to limit their opportunities, despite their military achievements. Yet he also understood that their service had contributed to changes that would ultimately transform American society as well. The evidence provided by African American military competence would become impossible to ignore as American society grappled with the contradictions between fighting against racial supremacy abroad while maintaining racial segregation at home. The final phase of Hayes's battalion's European service occurred throughout the spring of 1946, as they completed their occupation duties and prepared for redeployment to the United States. Their performance during 14 months of post-conflict responsibilities had continued to demonstrate African American competence and professionalism. The German communities they had served expressed genuine appreciation for their contributions to reconstruction and civil order. Many German civilians acknowledged that their previous assumptions about racial differences had been challenged by their direct experience with competent, dignified African American personnel. These acknowledgments represented more than polite courtesy. They reflected genuine recognition that racial supremacy theories had been contradicted by observable evidence. The systematic nature of these revelations throughout German society would contribute to fundamental changes in European attitudes toward racial matters. As the battalion prepared for their departure from Germany, Hayes conducted final briefings with his senior staff about the historical significance of what they had accomplished. Their military achievements had been exceptional by any standard, but their broader contribution to human understanding had been unprecedented. They had demonstrated that racial supremacy ideology was not just morally wrong, but factually incorrect. The evidence they had provided would influence understanding of human equality and social organization for generations to come. Their service had contributed to one of the most significant transformations in human consciousness in recorded history. Sergeant Washington packed his personal equipment for the final time as the battalion prepared for their return voyage to the United States. His experience in Germany had provided him with unique insights into the power of personal example to challenge deeply held beliefs and transform social understanding. Washington had observed the gradual collapse of racial ideology among German personnel who had been forced to confront evidence that contradicted their fundamental assumptions. Their confusion and eventual acknowledgement that their beliefs had been incorrect demonstrated how direct experience could achieve what argument could not. Washington understood that he had participated in something historically unprecedented. His military service had contributed to the systematic demonstration that racial theories were scientifically invalid. The evidence he and his fellow soldiers had provided would influence human understanding for decades to come. As Washington boarded the transport ship for the Atlantic crossing, he reflected on the irony of returning to a nation where racial discrimination would continue to limit his opportunities despite his military achievements. Yet he also understood that his service had contributed to changes that would ultimately transform American society. The contradictions between fighting against racial supremacy abroad while experiencing racial discrimination at home would become increasingly difficult to maintain. The evidence provided by African American military service would contribute to civil rights advances that would reshape American society over the following decades. The transport convoy carrying Hayes's battalion departed from Bremen in late May 1946, bringing to a close their European service that had lasted nearly 2 years. As the German coastline disappeared below the horizon, the soldiers aboard reflected on their extraordinary experiences and achievements. They had participated in the defeat of the most racially ideological regime in human history through military competence that had systematically contradicted theories of racial hierarchy. Their service had provided evidence that would influence understanding of human equality for generations to come. The German officers who had surrendered to their unit would spend the rest of their lives grappling with the implications of their experience. Their acknowledgement that racial supremacy theories were incorrect would contribute to fundamental transformations in European society that would reshape international attitudes toward racial matters. The broader implications of their achievements would unfold over subsequent decades, as both American and European societies confronted the contradictions exposed by African American military service. The evidence they had provided would become impossible to ignore or dismiss through rationalization. As the convoy approached the American coastline in early June, Hayes's soldiers prepared for their return to a society that would provide both recognition and discrimination in confusing combinations. Their military achievements would be celebrated, while racial barriers continued to limit their civilian opportunities. Yet they also understood that their service had contributed to changes that would ultimately transform American society. The evidence they had provided of African American competence and patriotism would become powerful arguments for civil rights advances that would reshape the nation over the following decades. The historical significance of their European service would become apparent only gradually, as American society grappled with the implications of evidence that had destroyed fundamental assumptions about racial hierarchy and human worth. They had participated in one of the most significant transformations in human consciousness in recorded history. Their return to civilian life would bring new challenges as they sought to translate their military achievements into civilian success, despite continuing racial discrimination. Yet their confidence had been permanently transformed by their recognition that they had proven their worth under the most demanding circumstances imaginable. The memory of German officers acknowledging that racial supremacy theories were incorrect would sustain them through the difficulties of readjusting to American racial restrictions. They had witnessed the collapse of racial ideology through their own professional competence and personal dignity. As the transport ships entered New York Harbor and the Statue of Liberty came into view, Hayes's soldiers understood that they were returning as different men than those who had departed 2 years earlier. Their experiences had transformed not only their own consciousness, but had contributed to transformations that would reshape human understanding of racial matters. They had participated in the systematic demonstration that racial supremacy ideology was factually incorrect rather than merely morally objectionable. The evidence they had provided would influence international understanding of human equality for generations to come. Their European service had proven that diversity could strengthen rather than weaken military effectiveness. That competence and character were determined by factors other than racial background, and that racial theories were contradicted by observable reality when examined objectively. The German officers who had surrendered to their unit would carry these memories for the rest of their lives, contributing to fundamental changes in European attitudes toward racial matters that would influence international society for decades. As the ships docked and the soldiers prepared to disembark, they carried with them the knowledge that they had participated in something historically unprecedented, the systematic destruction of racial ideology through evidence too compelling to dismiss or ignore. Their military service had contributed to one of the most significant advances in human understanding in recorded history, proving through personal example that racial supremacy theories were scientifically invalid and morally indefensible. The transformation they had witnessed among German personnel, who had been forced to acknowledge that their racial assumptions were incorrect, would influence post-conflict reconstruction of both European and American society in ways that would reshape the modern world. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.